Welcome, everyone, to the first panel of UT Energy Week 2021, Energy Transition, Past, Present, and Future. In this panel, we'll have three academic experts discuss the context of the energy transitions, defining it. What does it mean when someone says there's an energy transition going on or has happened in the past? So how do people think about defining an energy transition? How do we think about it going forward into the future in a low carbon context? And how do we put it in the context of historical changes and different events in which people might have perceived a past energy transition? So with that said, I will now start to introduce our three panelists. First, we have Benjamin Sovacool. He's a professor in energy policy at the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex Business School in England. Professor Sovacool works as a researcher and consultant on issues pertaining to global energy policy and politics, energy security, energy justice, climate change mitigation, and climate change adaptation. His findings have advised US presidents, and he's a lead author on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's Sixth Assessment Report. So welcome to Benjamin. The next person who will speak on our panel is Sonia Carley. Sonia is professor at the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. Professor Carley's research focuses on policy and other efforts aimed at advancing the innovation of low carbon and energy efficient technologies in both the electricity and transportation sectors. As a member of the Indiana University faculty since 2010, Professor Carley teaches courses on energy economics, markets, and policy. And finally, the third panelist is Aldo Flores. Aldo is a visiting professor here at the University of Texas LBJ School of Public Affairs. Before coming here, Aldo was former Deputy Secretary of Energy for Hydrocarbons at Mexico's Ministry of Energy from 2016 to 2018. And he led a team of more than 180 government officials implementing the historic opening of Mexico's hydrocarbon sector during its restructuring period. And he launched an oil exploration strategy and production auctions. He helped liberalize Mexico's markets for refined products and natural gas. Before that position, he was Secretary General of the International Energy Forum and Assistant Secretary for International Affairs at Mexico's Ministry of Energy, where he represented Mexico at several international organizations, including the International Atomic Nuclear Agency and the United Nations. So welcome to all three of you. Just to give information to the people viewing, we're going to have some opening statements from each person, and that will take about 5 minutes each. Then we'll have a period of discussion, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So please submit questions in the upper right corner using the Q&A feature. While you're watching, submit questions, and those will be filtered as our discussion and talks are ongoing, and we'll get to those the best we can at the end. So with that said, I will now pass it over to Professor Sovacool.
Thank you very much, and a special thank you to Varun Rai for inviting us to participate. And I'm really honored to be on such an incredible, diverse panel. I get to go first, and one of the things that I get to do is start you off with defining the transition. And I know definitions can also be usually very boring, but they're really important when we talk about something like transitions. And that's because, as you might imagine, no academic community really agrees on what a transition is. And so, as you might intuit from some of the earlier statements, the kind of traditional notion of a transition is it's changing energy technologies or fuel sources. And so it would be phasing in nuclear power rather than, say, natural gas, or maybe renewable energy over coal. And there's even a stream of work called SOS, Security of Supply, that talks about changes in that aspect of energy transitions. But it isn't the only way that we can actually conceptualize of a transition. You can also change, if you keep fuel supplies the same, you could still change the devices that use or exploit energy. These are sometimes called prime movers, like natural gas turbines or internal combustion engines, sometimes end-use devices like microwaves or computers or mobile phones. And you can also aggressively shift how they use energy via energy efficiency and better design. A third way actually has very little to do with technology, and everything to do with institutions. And so here you could change the markets, the institutional architectures behind energy systems. And some of you may know there's been a huge debate in the US over whether energy markets should be monopoly markets with a kind of standard rate of return or competitive, restructured, liberalized markets. And around the world, there's this debate about energy system restructuring. And you can have very strong institutional shifts in energy regimes like Cuba after the fall of the USSR that had very little to do with technology and everything to do with politics and the institutions governing energy. And you finally have people talking about diffusion and innovation and kind of behavioral change. And you have a lot of scholarship here that talks about how long it might take to adopt a new technology as it innovates from kind of R&D to commercialization to kind of market saturation. Everett Rogers even has a theory of innovation that talks about early adopters and late adopters and laggards and how each of them has different kind of demographic attributes. We tend to think that an energy transition could be all of these things at all of these kind of points of technology and end use devices and markets and institutions and kind of behavioral attributes and demographic changes. And you can also have them occur at a whole variety of scales, like the campus of UT Austin to Texas as a state, to regions and countries and entire, interregional places like the European Union or North America. The historical record is quite pessimistic at talking about how transitions often take a long time. So this graph here I've circled for you shows that historical transitions, even in places that are relatively small, like Europe in terms of geographic space, still took, centuries to decades to occur. And this was even though things like coal and steam power and Watt's engine had so many advantages over animate power or wood that they were replacing, it still took 160 years in England. And a more recent transition to things like liquid oil or electricity also took half a century or longer, even though they were relatively close by places like Portugal and the Netherlands. It took even longer to see those things proliferate to China or the United States. This has caused some, like Vaclav Smil, who's a Canadian geographer, to kind of make these quotes that energy transitions, because of these dynamics, are always inherently intergenerational prolonged affairs. And he even is so bold as saying it is impossible to accelerate their progress, even if you want to use highly effective interventions like carbon taxes. And you can plot some of Smil's data here. This is the same data plotted two ways. It's kind of neat to see the timeline, and the bottom one just adds up the timeline because it's hard to add when you see things horizontally. And you can see that the big three energy transitions of modernity, transition of coal, transition of oil, transition of natural gas, took 80 to 118 years, even though all three of these energy systems had really neat advantages over what they were replacing. And this was just to achieve 25% total primary energy supply share globally. It took even longer to reach higher than 30% or 40%. And some technologies like nuclear power, which we've been promoting since the 50s, commercially at least, and wind power, we've been promoting commercially since the late 80s, still haven't even come close to that 25% share of total energy supply. We've done a little bit of work that challenges that view, looking hard if you can pick extreme cases of rapid transitions. We've mapped out 10 here across a variety of domains of supply and end-use devices, things like cook stoves in China or flex fuel vehicles in Brazil or nuclear power in France or the Dutch dash for gas. And what's really neat is you can see all these transitions actually took remarkably quick. Some of them took a year, some took 2 years, all of them took it about 16 years or less. And if you look at the part on the right, it's hard to see here, these transitions were not negligible. They ended up affecting 960 million people, almost 1 billion people have seen how they use energy change in some fashion in our generation. We're not talking about historical generations like whale oil or the transition from wood to other forms of energy in the 18 or 1900s. These are recent, timely transitions that affected 1 in 8 people roughly around our wonderful world. And I think that was really what I wanted to do to set up the debate as we talk about these transitions and whether they can be fast or slow and what might be at stake as we talk about changing technologies, markets, and our demand patterns.
Thank you, Benjamin. And now let's pass it directly over to Professor Carley.
Wonderful. Thank you, Benjamin. Thank you, Carrie, for kicking us off. And in my brief remarks, I'd like to make 3 primary points today. And in doing so, I will pull from some of my research as well as others' research. The first point is that when we think about, conceive of, and plan for the energy transition, we tend to do so through a focus, almost exclusive focus on technology and technological pathways. And this is, of course, a very important approach to thinking about decarbonization, but we oftentimes do so at the exclusion of other very important factors, such as social factors, cultural factors, and political factors. Now, to illustrate this point, I have a visual, a schematic of Appalachia, and this is based on field work and interviews that our research team has conducted there. And I have some quotes from research that we've published, and what these quotes highlight is some of the social and cultural challenges that these communities are facing. These are communities on the front lines that are losing their jobs in Appalachia. And the first quote on the left focuses on how these individuals feel as though they've been used and abused. And now, as the country is changing from dependence on coal towards other resources, they feel left behind or neglected. And the quote on the right is about social and cultural identity and how interwoven one's identity is with coal and coal mining and coal operations within these communities. So as we think about the transition, we really need to think about these social and cultural factors and who's facing these challenges on the front line. Next slide, please. The second point I'd like to make is that a just transition must include those that work within legacy fossil fuel industries, as I just noted, but that there are many, many other communities, individuals, households that also operate on the front line and that are very vulnerable to the energy transition as well. Now, what this schematic is showing is a conception of vulnerability that is broken down into exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And I think that the exposure angle highlights my point the most here. We can think of exposure as one who might lose their job, for example, or their community might lose their tax revenue from coal mining operations. But there are many other sources of exposure to the energy transition, such as a change in property values or a change in energy prices. And some households might be more sensitive to these changes than others. And that brings us to the sensitivity area, where we think about it's not just those that operate or work within the legacy fossil fuel industries, but it's others. It's other social demographic groups that might stand to lose, such as low-income households, for example, or communities of color, for example. And the adaptive capacity programs that exist across the country and across the world may or may not be ready to help all of these different frontline communities. Next slide, please. So let me give you a few examples of some of these other sources of vulnerability. The first is energy insecurity. Energy insecurity is defined as the inability to pay one's energy bill or to avoid utility disconnection. And what we know from our ongoing research, as well as others' research that's come before us, is that energy insecurity is a pervasive problem within the United States and across the entire world, and that it's growing. It's growing as a result of the energy transition, and very recently it's growing as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we know that there are disparities across households as to who faces more severe rates of energy insecurity. As this graph shows from our work, households that identify as Black or Hispanic are much more likely to be energy insecure than our households that identify as white. Next slide, please. Another equity or justice dimension to the energy transition, and those that might be on the front lines, are those that don't have access to the new low carbon efficient technologies that come with the transition, such as electric vehicles, LED light bulbs, smart meters, you name it. There is ample research at this point that argues that low income communities in particular, as well as communities of color, don't tend to have access to these technologies at the same rates as other communities do. And oftentimes the tax incentives or other public policies that are available to incentivize these different technologies don't flow to these communities. Next slide. We also know that opportunities for employment are not equally shared across populations. We know in particular that women and people of color are less likely to be employed in the clean energy industry. And we also know that engagement in policymaking and decision-making processes is not all-inclusive. It's not available for everybody who would like to have a say and be a leader in planning for the future and planning for the energy transition. Next slide, please. This is a piece actually that I'd like to pull that Benjamin recently published, and this is case studies from around the world, about 200 different case studies that just highlights the extreme range of different social demographic groups and individuals, entire populations that are facing some of the burdens associated with the energy transition because they may live near, for example, mining operations or extraction operations or production operations, or be displaced from them. Final slide, please. Which brings me to my third point, and that is that the energy transition may in fact be slow, although of course there's mixed evidence as we discussed, but the changes within specific communities are happening very fast, and so fast that many communities that are on the front lines are unprepared for the energy transition. Now, this is something that we're finding in our ongoing work with municipalities across the United States in tracking the programs and policies that they have in place and how they correlate with job losses, for example, or energy price changes. But it's also illustrated by this map here, which is a count of different energy justice and just transition programs that we were able to identify across the United States. And what you can see here is that although some places have many programs in place, the majority have only a handful, and some states have no programs that are targeting these frontline communities that are disproportionately burdened or not helped by the energy transition. So with that, I'll turn it over to Aldo.
All right, thank you, Sonia. So Aldo, finish us up on our opening remarks. Go ahead.
Thank you, and very happy to participate here, and quite honored to be part of this group. I will be relying on some slides as well, and this will be a perspective on the energy outlook. Think about the present and the future mostly. Next slide, please. This slide presents the changes every year, percentage changes of global CO2 emissions. And what I want to underscore is that if you see when they become negative, it's not because of an energy transition or because of a great contribution from renewable energies. It is because the economic cycle is on the downside. That's in the 1970s, partly in the early 90s with the recession and the fall of the Soviet Union. Certainly, if you move towards the right, during the financial crisis, and now the latest one with the COVID pandemic. So a huge challenge for an energy transition is to continue to generate prosperity and economic growth without increasing the use of fossil fuel energies or of CO2 emissions. That remains a very challenging agenda. Next slide, please. Now, if we think about the energy we will need in the future and how it is distributed among different energy sources, we can see that the path of future primary energy demand still depends strongly on policy and technology. And by that I mean that we can see on the two columns on the left is the current global energy mix. The columns on the right, the 5 columns on the right, represent scenarios of what that energy mix might be in 2040. Those that have most colors represent the use of energy sources that we already know. The 2 columns on the right that have the gray segments represent advances in renewables and in their deployment that depend on technology and policy. So the first point here is that if you look to the columns on the left, close to 75 to 80% of the current energy system relies still on fossil fuels. And that's using estimates from the IEA on the very left and of OPEC, the next column. If you move to the columns on the right, we have these various scenarios of the IEA and OPEC. And as you can see, in most of them, we still are using in the next 20 years, and then we could move it even longer, mostly fossil fuels. So this challenge of the energy transition is already underscored by what Ben said earlier. They take a long time. And we currently have a system of investments and infrastructure that makes it more difficult to incorporate some of the new energy sources, at least from the supply side. On the consumption side, on the infrastructure, say for distributing electricity, we can use the same infrastructure, and that's partly why nuclear energy became such a success immediately after the Second World War. But we still have many other challenges to address. So the future is still, as far as we know, unless policy makes a strong change and technology as well, is still one dominated by fossil fuels. Next slide, please. And well, this is the same information, but it underscores it more clearly, because now you're seeing the information in percentages, and you can see that it is very emphatically a feature of fossil fuels. There's an increase in renewables, but still not to the degree to where they say they even match the participation of biomass, for example. And this is a huge challenge as well, because about 1 billion people on the planet are still relying on biomass for their primary energy needs. Next slide, please. So now focusing on liquid fuels, these are demand projections as well for the future. And what we can see is that the scenario at the very top, which is business as usual, is now already reflecting a flat demand path. So it means that we might be curtailing, given the pattern of energy demand in transportation, the growth in energy consumption. The other two scenarios that you see there, the dashed lines, represent again what policy and technology might accomplish. The most ambitious scenario is not one on which we're on track to accomplish, implies that we really change the current energy system so that CO2 emissions go down and in line with climate change. We're most likely to see the scenario on the top, which on the plus side, it means a flat increase, a flat continuation of demand patterns in the transportation sector. But that again is subject to a whole set of assumptions that have yet to be materialized. And lastly, the last slide, please. I just want to emphasize that the transition has also this geographic dimension, and it is where the demand is coming from. And only 30 years ago, about 2/3 of global demand was concentrated in the OECD countries, that it's in the Atlantic, Europe, the United States. But now it has shifted, and most of the action is taking place in Asia. And more than half, and very soon 2/3 of global demand will be Asia-based. So the transition has to be intelligent enough, not only to address the technological challenges and social challenges that have been already emphasized by Ben and Sania, but also the fact that it has to make a difference where the center of demand is taking place, and that is in Asia. And I will leave here also my opening comments, and very much looking forward to our conversation.
Okay, thank you to all three of you. So again, in the audience, please submit questions. We'll get to those in 20 or 30 minutes. But maybe we'll start our discussion here with a simple question, and then maybe you can respond to anything anybody else said. But given the definitions of transition, is a low carbon energy transition happening now? If you look at carbon intensity, carbon emissions per GDP, you might say yes. If you look at the actual carbon emissions rates, as Aldo pointed out, they're still going up. You might say no. Any definitive answer? We'll start with Benjamin and go through our order of speakers, and go ahead.
Thanks, Gary. So, I mean, of course, the answer is kind of yes and no. It does go back to the definitional issue I mentioned earlier. There's a sociologist that Sonia and I know called Richard York, who had a really provocative article last year called Energy Additions rather than Energy Transitions. And I think that summarizes kind of where we are right now. We're kind of adding in low carbon sources, but we're having to meet increases in consumption, increases in population, especially in areas like Africa and Asia that are still electrifying. We still have 650 million people without any electricity access, and we have about 1 billion people who cook with solid fuel. So meeting their energy demand will necessitate that we continue to increase consumption for at least the next decade or so. That said, we are decarbonizing, especially in electricity and a few other areas like heat and a little bit of transport. But I think Richard York is kind of right. Right now, they see more additions than transitions.
Sonia, any follow-up?
And sure, I completely agree with Benjamin there. I'll just add that, coming back to my third point, that more broadly, we may see only modest change or transition, I think for the reason that Benjamin really highlighted there. But on the ground, in individual communities, we see massive change in some places all across the entire world. I'll also point to a paper, I think, that was published by good folks at Resources for the Future that also argue that with energy transitions, we never ever truly leave things, like we never get to zero with anything. So we transition things out, but they never are fully out. We still use them to some degree. And I think that that's the case with some of our more carbon intensive energy sources presently.
Anything, Aldo?
I will add to this very last point that Sonia said. We're 200 years away from the Industrial Revolution, give or take. And we still are using 25% of coal for our energy needs. So yes, energy transitions don't disappear, older energy sources. We're still relying on biomass as well. And what we're seeing therefore is additions more than fundamental shifts in the energy system. Where I see the shifts going faster is where we have an infrastructure on the demand side for using it in a more efficient way with some of these innovations. And let me just point to two things very quickly. One of them, which is not the transition we're thinking about, but think of the shale revolution, or the unconventional revolution in the US. It was a very sudden disruption. I mean, there was a longer process of technological innovation, but when it finally everything clicked, it was a very sudden disruption of global oil markets. And it was possible because the applications for the use of oil were already there. So it was very quickly spread, this new addition to global supply and used in the global energy system. So that can be disruptive. The second observation, and I don't have a solution to it, is that we see transitions in many other sectors all the time. We see technological innovations. I don't know, the computers, think of cars and things like that. And they also are disruptive for communities. And somehow many of them are already accepted socially that this is what competition and innovation does. But in other parts, they become much more difficult to solve, perhaps because many communities do rely on one or two businesses, energy businesses, in order to survive. And that's where the challenge of the just transition also comes.
Right, Aldo, thanks. That kind of goes in to maybe a next question a little bit here. And Sonia touched on this in her opening remarks, which is to say some regions or some communities might benefit or see detrimental impacts from one given economic activity or another, or a transition. And here we're talking about energy transitions, and she mentioned coal mining areas as an example that might see to economically suffer to some degree from a transition to more renewables and low carbon. So I'll start with Sonia here. How useful is it? Is this a useful social conversation to have to talk about? I don't know, for lack of better terms, winners and losers when we're talking about a global issue. And how have we thought about? Did past transitions consider winner or losers? Did we just kind of, steamroll over whoever was needed by whoever was in charge of making decisions? And we're sort of conscious of that now, maybe more so than we were. Are the social factors the slower part rather than the technology? Or do we know that since you brought it up? So there's too many questions, but see what you can do. Go ahead.
Yeah, you might need to help remind me of the various questions. But okay, so winners and losers. I don't know that maybe this is too nitpicky. I'd rather us not talk about them as winners and losers. I'd like to think about how we ensure that we're inclusive and we have equity and justice as key criteria in this transition. along with efficiency and cost effectiveness. Have we considered, I think this was the second question, have we considered winners and losers in the past? Well, I would argue that we are at a turning point in our public policy debates in thinking about and prioritizing equity and justice as important criteria, whereas I don't think that historically we have done a very good job of that. We are finally at a point where we can say definitively that these factors matter. Help remind me of the third one, Carrie, I'm sorry.
Oh, it's to some degree if we're talking about a transition, energy transition, however you want to define it, and here maybe low carbon, are the social factors slowing things down more than the technological factors, or can we even tell?
Yeah, well, I think, I don't know about pace. Maybe Benjamin might have a better, more satisfying answer there, but I do think that they're the biggest unknowns. And that when we think about the transition, again, we talk about technology quite a bit. Well, I think we actually know more about technologies and their applications and how well they can fit together than we do about some of the social and behavioral side of things. And so I think how well we can help certain communities, how well people adapt to the various technologies that are available. These are the biggest unknowns that we need to know more about before planning.
Right, so I like your statement there. I don't think I want to talk about winners or losers either. So I think that's a bad way to make progress. Aldo, any comments on Sonia there?
No, as I was listening to Sonia, I was thinking about what type of policy instruments we could have in the social safety net to ease the transition. And again, this is not unlike a conversation that we could have say when we lower trade barriers. There's a lot of disruption in some communities, and we have to help them retool and support them in order to, and retrain, and the whole set of activities in order for them to go to a different energy sector, or a different sector rather. In this case, it's an energy sector, maybe shifting to a new energy sector, a new economic activity. It means that the transition is not only about energy policy, but about social policy and this type of enablers that will help people move from one sector to another.
Benjamin, anything here on speeds and social versus technology?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think it's both technology and behavior are going to be really important. We need to continue doing innovation as well as promoting behavioral change. And you can get very large wedges of emissions reductions by improving efficiency, but also by doing things like cycling more and eating meat less. I just wanted to add 3 quick thoughts that help bracket this discussion. So there is a principle known as energy return on investment that talks about kind of the amount of energy you put into a technology and then get out of it. And I've seen some good work by Cutler Cleveland at Boston University that talks about like grand civilizational transitions to different energy sources. And as soon as their energy return on investment drops below a certain level, society tends to move on. And his assessment argued that we passed that threshold for oil, gas, and coal about 20 years ago. So that would imply that at a maybe slower pace, civilization has decided we're now seeking other energy systems that have energy return on investment that's far better: nuclear power, hydropower, wind energy. The second thing, Sonia kind of hinted at this, there are innovation dynamics that can be really neat that also accelerate transitions. You can call them innovation spillovers or innovation ecosystems. The good example here is the German feed-in tariff for solar energy catalyzing Chinese manufacturing that hardly anyone anticipated. It's almost as dramatic a change as Aldo talking about the shale gas shock. Not many people saw the solar shock that was coming, including the Germans, because they ended up seeing a lot of their solar manufacturing capacity go bankrupt because they couldn't compete with the Chinese. And then the final thing I wanted to say is there's been some really interesting work that I haven't been a part of, but I've read on social tipping points. This is really good work that argues that separate from technology, society has come together in various social movements like suffrage, abolition of slavery. If you want a really cheeky example, the Prohibition, the women's temperance movement, where we abolished alcohol in like 10 years. So it's like there are situations where we can come together. In the environment, it's things like the ozone protocol, CFC depletion, socially, and then technology follows that. So you don't have to rely on technology for shocks. There can also be these really neat social tipping points, although I don't think we're quite there yet for climate change.
right? And I guess with prohibition, we can reverse some of the transition and go back. So we're where we are now. Maybe a short question here is, we're talking about an energy transition, but in terms of disruption and social impacts, is energy special in a particular way? Anyone? Benjamin, you were speaking near and dear to my heart with energy return on investment. So I definitely think energy special. And yes, the 1970s were characterized by the somewhat spending thresholds in terms of the money spent on energy per GDP. It was a high number, only reached again in 2008, and those are both times of economic turmoil. So is energy special? Anyone?
I mean, quickly, and I want to pass it to Aldo and Sonia. I think that there's a case to be made that it is and that it isn't. In terms of it isn't, energy is one of many collective action problems along with climate change. And people like Eleanor Ostrom have talked about how energy is a common goods problem, but so is deforestation, and so is water, and so is weapons proliferation. So like, it's one of these kind of collective action problems that is not unique, that we do all the time because we can socialize costs and there's politics and corruption and all of that. On the other hand, I do think energy is a bit unique in that it is more tightly coupled than many other socio-technical systems. It's more vertically, horizontally layered. E.F. Schumacher said that energy is not a commodity. It's a prerequisite for all commodities, right? So in a way, it's like a meta good and service that isn't like any other thing that we need because it's so vital to our human societies. And the final thing I think that's unique is energy might be able to cause more externalities than a lot of these other sectors. We just did a meta-analysis this year that estimates the externalities from energy and transport at $26 trillion a year. Like, there are very few industries that can cause that much social damage. So that would imply energy is a bit special.
Any other follow-up from anyone?
I think it's special energy in the sense that it is the source of emissions that are so important to our daily lives and to climate change. So there is no escaping that. And the other fact is that right now, there is no escaping the fact that we need fossil fuels to move things around. So unless the transportation system changes in a fundamental way, we're still stuck with this way of doing things. The number of investments, the infrastructure, again, that has been deployed around the planet for land, air, and maritime transportation relies on a very limited set of fuels. And that will not change very soon unless there's some major technological breakthrough, say with the electric engine or who knows. So that makes it special, that we don't have as many options to address the problem. And if you add this complication that Ben just mentioned of collective action, it makes it even much more challenging.
I'll just add very quickly, I think the answer is yes and no. No, in the sense that energy systems are part of our capitalist system, and it just so happens that this is the heyday for energy. But yes, it's particularly important and special because energy is such a huge driver for all of our economies. But it also is felt on a local, personal scale that every individual interacts with energy systems constantly throughout the entire day, almost every second of their waking time.
Okay, maybe I'll ask one more here and then get to a couple of audience questions. In our preparations, Aldo brought up that there's now 3 or 4 R's maybe instead of 3 R's. There's the classic reduce, reuse, recycle, but maybe now people are adding another R for remove, meaning remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And I like to, this is sort of a blend between technology and social thinking, but I like to think there's techno-optimists that think technology is going to solve the problem. And if we incentivize that enough, we will do it, in the sense that we will create affordable direct air capture and just suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. And then there may be the techno-realist camp who says, yeah, we have technology, but there are physical limits and thermodynamic limits and energy return on investment ideas and depletion. And we are not fully recycling or reusing everything that we could be possibly doing right now. So what are your thoughts on this, either techno-realism and techno-optimism, or just other interplays of technology and social policy to affect lowering emissions, which, as Aldo has pointed out, we'll start with Aldo maybe, we're not reducing emissions yet. Everybody says we have all the technologies we need. What's going on here?
The 4 Rs you mentioned are part of this idea of the circular carbon economy. And the value that I see in that concept is that it is already emphasizing that we need action on multiple fronts at the same time, differentiated according to the capabilities of different countries. That means that techno-optimism or realism is not beside the point, but it really is something that will vary depending on where the application is used or deployed, in what part of the planet and in what industry. The point is that we need to act on all those 4 fronts if we want to see meaningful change. And we cannot predict where it will be coming. To go back to the example of the shale revolution, there were thousands of businessmen trying to make a profit from the oil industry. Who could have predicted in 2005 or 1995 that this particular businessman in this corner of Texas would have cracked the code to make this happen? And so right now it's very difficult to say that, but we do know that we have a better shot if we have governments that are incentivizing progress in these 4 areas. And someone will come up with or a group of people will come up with a set of innovations that will maybe help us move faster in the right direction.
Benjamin, anything?
Yeah, we've done a little bit of work on energy visions, as well as like utopianism and other types of things that happen. And it's tricky because on the one hand, the visions are really inspiring. They can motivate people to get excited about the future. They can capture young attitudes, right? Get more people caring about climate. But on the other hand, they can kind of blind you to some of the real downsides of some of the innovations we're talking about, whether it's hydrogen or small modular reactors or negative emissions. And these can be very risky technologies. So I think we need a bit of both. We need kind of optimistic thinking to inspire, a kind of careful, balanced, reflective thinking. And maybe that's the dynamic. We need camps of optimists to then have intelligent discussion with realists. And it's that dynamic itself that drives forward social change.
Great. Sanja?
Nothing else to add.
All right. That's okay. That's I like that statement there from Benjamin. Thank you. So this is maybe sort of an audience question here, somewhat implied by Aldo, but any of you can answer, of course. Can you talk about the process to affect social policy and behavioral change? So Aldo is saying, well, you don't know exactly where it's going to occur, but if you're making a policy to go low carbon or perhaps circular economy, are there some examples of, here's the details you actually have to pay attention to?
The first thing is that the right policy approach is not exactly to promote a technology, but to promote an objective, right? So the objective could be energy savings, less electricity consumption at homes, and you promote that as opposed to a particular type of bulb or a particular type of air conditioning set, or who knows what. So you have to create policies that are, in a sense, that general, so that people see that there is that incentive of innovation in that sector. I guess the key challenge is how to find the right timing to do that. Political systems are not very conducive to this type of disruptive change unless there's a crisis or a major social shift in preferences that is reflected in electoral processes and the like. So this is the question with climate policy and it's the related energy policy. We are seeing what appears to be a slow motion crash, and it's not, therefore it's not fast enough for people to realize that action in a more dramatic sense is required. And then again, it's very difficult to move faster because of the economic implications. But one beginning would be there.
Thanks. Sanja, anything?
Yeah, I'll take the perspective. Well, first, I think communication is of the utmost importance, and I think politics is the number one barrier. So just building on all those points, but also just thinking about social policy for those communities that are on the front lines, as opposed to just kind of social efforts to help everybody transition and to adopt the disruptive technologies. But thinking about those on the front lines, I think it's essential that we involve these individuals in these communities in our decision-making processes and in the interventions that we propose. And in fact, we should facilitate bottom-up decision-making within communities. If they are experiencing disproportionate burdens as a result of the transition and they need some kind of efforts or interventions to help them, let's communicate with them. Let's figure out what those efforts might be and how we can have some kind of coordinated approach.
Anything, Benjamin?
Yeah, I just wanted to give a little bit of optimism. We had a great project that ended a few years ago called HOPE. So there you go, Household Preferences for Energy. And it was in 4 high-income countries, so not the US, but countries that are somewhat similar, countries like Germany or France or Norway and Sweden. And it was kind of what Sonia said. We worked with hundreds of households to document their actual carbon footprints and then ask them and work with them to reduce their carbon footprints. And we did carbon auditing, we played games, we did interviews and policy mapping. And the 2 findings that were really interesting is that these households, if you just inform them, will voluntarily cut about half their emissions without any financial incentives, just by giving them education, giving them tools, showing them their footprints, and kind of saying, if you ate a little less meat, if you did less one airfare trip, if you walked to work a few days a week, you cut your footprints. However, that's only half. For the other half of the emissions reductions, they had to be forced, or if you want a better term, nudged or incentivized. And I think that's the rub. It's like voluntary goodwill will get us pretty far. Half is amazing, but the climate doesn't care about half. The climate needs net zero. And that also implies that that other half might be, unfortunately, strong command and control policies that will push us the rest of the way because we won't do it on our own.
Right, I think that's good points there. Here's a question, maybe to start with Sonia. It's kind of about low-income communities, adoption of low-carbon technologies and energy insecurity. How do we view dealing with energy insecurity? Is this specifically an energy issue, or is it an economic issue in terms of, taxing people differently and shifting, revenues to low-income people? I mean, there are programs for low-income energy, as well as low-income other types of things. So some people might claim that certain policies they observe in given states are disproportionately regressive, and may or may not be implying that that's because of a low-carbon transition. But how do we think about that in terms of energy versus just economic policy, and how should we help? How do you think we should help low-income communities on this respect? Go ahead.
Yeah, great question. So summarize the problem and possible solutions. So the problem of energy insecurity, you're exactly right. It is more than just an energy story. It's a story about economics. It's a story about inequalities within our economic systems writ large. Those households that suffer from energy insecurity likely suffer from other forms of insecurity as well. Water insecurity, food insecurity. I mean, these are households who have to make the very difficult decisions, such as whether to pay for energy bills or put food on the table or pay for their medical bills. And these are just decisions that are almost incomprehensible to have to think through. What are possible solutions? So I think that there are a lot of possible solutions. I think that providing weatherization assistance to help households increase the energy efficiency and the ability of their homes to withstand weather is a very important kind of pre-step that should be taken to help households avoid energy insecurity entirely. Another important step is to provide energy assistance, bill paying assistance, and this can be done through the government. It can also be done through a variety of different organizations, or even, a household friend might be willing to provide money to help lower energy bills. Another solution is to help households provide incentives for solar panels, for example, so that a household can provide their own electricity and don't have to be reliant on their electricity provider for electricity. It will also lower their bills, of course. And then we can also take the more extreme, maybe draconian measure of outlawing or banning utility disconnections, especially in times of crisis, such as during the COVID-19 pandemic. Arguably, the federal government could have made the decision to tell all utilities that they're not allowed to disconnect customers. I'll also just say that coming back to the main point, this isn't just an energy issue. There are other kinds of policy interventions that we should consider, such as housing interventions and other kind of social assistance programs that we can provide to help these households, since it's really not just an issue of them being able to pay their energy bill.
Right. Any comments by Aldo or Benjamin on energy insecurity?
Just a very small one. I think Sonia's answer is outstanding. There was a discussion a few decades ago about where you would do a carbon tax, and the kind of argument was you don't want to bother households with it because they don't have the time and there's too many uncertainties. So you could also go up a level to places like utilities and change how they provide energy. And that has the benefit of you don't have to deal with consumers at all. So rather than forcing a poor household to adopt solar, well, you get the electricity supplier to adopt it and incentivize it so it doesn't change prices, and then you've kind of everyone collectively adopts solar because you force the utility to. That's kind of what renewable portfolio standards are doing. The only problem with those is they're inconsistent between states. Some states like California have really good ones, and then like the South has like none, or they're voluntary. But I think that might be a neat tool as well, tools for electricity suppliers to complement tools for households.
Right, excellent. Here's a question that we were kind of talking about. Well, I guess this is a blend between inside of a country, let's just say the United States, but could be European countries as well, and international affairs. It's a question from the audience. Is the energy transition like globalization and trade liberalization, in the sense that the benefits are diffuse, at least maybe across the globe, but depends on, maybe a small number of people across the globe. But the harms, whatever the economic harms, social harms, environmental, are going to be localized to some degree. Benjamin's work on mining was highlighted, and the anecdote here is Michigan residents, implying Michigan residents still hate NAFTA. So we had Trump, we have, I don't know if we still have tariffs on solar panels imports right now, but these are sort of thinking about where are these things made and who benefits. So I guess I don't have the question was, is it, how does the energy transition fit in this kind of context of globalization? Is it just one other part of it, or is it special again? Aldo?
Well, that's where it fits with the discussion of whether there's something special about the transition or not. And the part that is not special is that we see changes in every economic sector all the time. And they don't necessarily generate upheavals or the political heat that we see sometimes with the energy industry. And what matters, for the example, say, of NAFTA and Michigan, is that those that hate it have specific assets that they invested, very expensive factories, say, for a dedicated purpose. But think of someone that owns, I don't know, a grocery store. They can restock relatively easily, change the product mix, even leave the sector without the type of costs that someone that has a very dedicated space for a particular set of machinery to produce a particular product will face. And that is the challenge with energy in many uses, specifically in transportation. We are stuck at each of our homes with very expensive specific investments to move around if you own a car. We have some other options, but they are not as competitive. And that's what makes this closer to this idea of the difficulties of trade adjustment or adjustments to trade and changes in trade patterns that many communities face.
Anything else by Benjamin and Arsanya?
I would just quickly add that it seems to be our answer today is kind of pros and cons. And on the one hand, kind of globalization, internationalization enable technology transfer, and there's like north-south technology transfer, even south-south technology transfer, like Mexico helping Rwanda. You even had this built into the Kyoto Protocol. They had a whole clean development mechanism that saw wealthy countries try to tech transfer stuff to help China and India and other countries mitigate their emissions. So there's the kind of benefits of synergies and cooperation there. Also, you see trends of what kind of Sonia said, global capitalism and going around, ravaging the earth, looking for communities to dispossess, and kind of, elites that use the system to externalize costs even more, or pilot risky technologies in places that don't have adequate regulations to stop them. So that's kind of exacerbating inequality and capital flight and Naomi Klein's disaster capitalism, like the worst. So you have both trends. As you internationalize, you have opportunities for technology transfer, but also more scope to exploit.
Right. It seems like it's often never an either or, but it's a both, right? And then this just enables people to talk about whichever part they want to talk about. And I'm thanking all three of you for trying to talk about both
Carrie,
parts at the same time.
The joke I remember is, I think Teddy Roosevelt said he once wanted a no-handed economist.
There you go.
Because all we say is on the one hand and on the other hand. You're certainly
Yeah.
getting that from us today.
Yeah, yeah.
Coming back to the question about whether the losers are localized, but the winners are universal. I think there's no denying that the winners are universal if we decarbonize because of the benefits of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. But I also think that there are localized benefits that are unevenly dispersed as well. And that was part of what I was trying to make as one of my opening points, that there are also immense benefits to the energy transition, employment benefits, for example, being empowered benefits, or benefits of having access to new technologies that are efficient and low carbon. And these are the kinds of benefits that are disproportionately owned by those of higher income. And from what we found various people have found in the literature, also by communities that are largely Caucasian.
Right. So maybe I'll go to this other audience question, start with Benjamin, which is saying, how do you communicate with local residents on the need to move faster on a low carbon transition, given how slow it's moving globally, and perhaps these sort of other things in the back of people's minds of, well, if you're in the OECD countries, we kind of have stagnant, relatively, energy consumption. And as Aldo pointed out, the growth is in the non-OECD countries, but we still consume a lot more. And how are you supposed to communicate that? Well, yeah, you have a better lifestyle, even though you may have seen your wages stagnate in your family for the last 50 years. Still help us out and conserve or figure out a way to lower emissions.
I mean, there's been great work very quickly in environmental psychology and values, about the different values people have. So I think try to find out their values and show how decarbonization fits in with some of those values in positive ways. And the other thing is, there's been good messages on framing and how you frame interventions, and even the words that you use and the symbolic cues that you use. And energy is one of those things that's so complex. It doesn't have to be framed as for the climate. It can be framed for resilience. It can be framed for jobs. It can be framed for future generations. It could be framed for health. So you can do all these other frames that recast energy decisions as far more. They're about equity, health, identity, politics. And if you find the right frame, you might be able to convince them.
Anything else, Aldo, Sonia, on that?
Well, I'll echo what has been mentioned. Sonia referred to communication and now went to framing. The fact is that good policies, and certainly policies linked to climate change and energy transition, fail when they are poorly communicated and poorly framed. And a lot of effort has to be put as well in thinking about how to communicate the energy transition and the new policies to enable it.
But if the framing is that flexible, can it go both ways then? And then you just have two different frames battling it out?
Well, frames do compete, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the art is in selecting the winning frame.
Yeah. All right. Well, hopefully we all have the winning frame of a lower carbon economy going forward. I think we're going to perhaps end it there before we go on a longer question as we enter the end of our time for this panel. So thank you very much. I think it was a very good discussion, a nice highlight of existing work and what we know. So again, this is Benjamin Sovacool, University of Sussex, Sonia Carley of the Indiana University, and Aldo Flores here at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. Thank you very much. And before I exit my moderating duties, I will just hand over the moderating duties to the next panel. This is going to be moderated by Dr. Ben Leibowitz. He's an assistant professor in our operations research department here at the University of Texas at Austin. And his panel is going to be a lot more about the technology. It's titled Technology Pathways, Fork in the Road, ? So how do we think about the role of technology? Again, thank you for all of you here on a very encompassing discussion of technology and policy. It's a great opening segment. Thank you for joining us again.